In 1660, as he lay dying after being beaten, James Naylor made the following statement. There is a spirit which I feel that delights to do no evil, nor avenge any wrong, but delights to endure all things in hope to enjoy its own in the end. Its hope is to outlive all wrath and contention, and to weary out all exaltation and cruelty, or whatever is of a nature contrary to itself. It sees to the end of all temptations. As it bears no evil in itself, so it conceives none in thought to any other. If it be betrayed, it bears it, for its ground and spring are the mercies and forgiveness of God. Its crown is meekness, its life is everlasting love unfeigned, and takes its kingdom with entreaty, and not with contention, and keeps it by lowliness of mind. In God alone it can rejoice, though none else regard it, or can own its life. It is conceived in sorrow, and brought forth without any to pity it, nor doth it murmur at grief and oppression. It never rejoiceth but through sufferings, for the world's joy it is murdered. I found it alone, being forsaken. I have fellowship therein with them who lived in dens and desolate places of the earth, who through death obtained this resurrection and eternal holy life.
This is the OIM Greek Bible study. This is session number 20, and we are reading the Gospel according to John, and we left off at chapter 12, verse 1. Are there any questions about what we covered last time from anyone, or comments?
Henry, I wonder if you would have anything to say about the chronology, which apparently is different in John than in the synoptics, as to what day these things were happening and how many years his ministry went. And maybe it doesn't matter. I just wonder if being written later, if there was more information that this gospel writer had.
I think the chronology didn't matter to the writers of the 4 canonical gospels. If you just look at the 3 synoptic gospels, that is Mark, Matthew, and Luke, it would appear that everything just occurred in 1 year as to the ministry of Jesus. However, if you look at the feasts that are mentioned in John, it's clearly at least 3 years, which to me would indicate that it probably was at least 3 years. It didn't really matter what the chronology was in terms of the writers of the synoptic gospels. Of course, Luke and Matthew used the gospel according to Mark as their primary source, and they basically added material to that gospel, which they already had available to them. There are a lot of what you would call discrepancies in time that obviously did not matter to the writers of these gospels. One in particular is the cleansing of the temple. If you read the 3 synoptic gospels and you compare it to a gospel according to John, one says that it occurs at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and the other says it occurred at the very end, before Jesus was arrested. And the reasons for that probably had to do with the focus of what was in the mindset of the writers as to what they were presenting and how they wanted to present it, rather than paying attention to the chronology. I don't have it on my screen, but if I could go back to what Origen said there, that the spiritual sense of what they wanted to say was more important than the literal sense. And even as to when the Last Supper was, and the crucifixion differs looking at the gospel according to John compared to the other 3 gospels. So there are spiritual reasons for that. I think we moderns would just have to say, we'd have to give the exact, accurate chronological time as to when these things happen. That didn't matter to these writers, but it drives us crazy, us more materialistic, scientific people, we have to have those exact dates and times. That wasn't a concern to these writers. And that's important to understand, because you'll find people who are opposed to Christianity pointing out these differences. These differences never seem to matter in early Christianity when you're looking at early Christian writings of the first 200, 300 years. Today, of course, with more scientific mind, more reductionist kinds of philosophies and whatever, people get annoyed and angry as though, you Christians, hey, it says this here and here's something very different. That wasn't a concern. And I don't think it should be a concern of us if we really understand that they were trying to get across a spiritual sense, and that was more important than a literal sense. I hope I've kind of answered some of the question. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Now, I should say what I just said, of course, would be argued. There'd be a huge argument between what I'm saying here as a conservative friend and perhaps more fundamentalist evangelical Christians as to how they understand what I've just said. But these are my beliefs, and these were the beliefs of early friends and early Christians. Any other comments, questions before we go on? Okay. So let's go to chapter 12, verse 1. And here we have Martha and Mary again. Okay, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." In verse 1, where it says, Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Again, this verb, raise, is the verb, one of the Greek verbs that means to raise or to resurrect. It actually means to get up, more literally to get up from sleep when you wake up in the morning. Or sleep is a euphemism, I should say, for dying. But this is a raising from death, or a raising from a getting up from sleeping. There they gave a dinner for him, for Lazarus. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Martha is in her usual mode of, well, I don't know how to describe her. I feel this way often myself. I got to do the physical kinds of things that need to be done first, but here she is serving them. And this word I've mentioned before, there's a word serve that and servant that often means slave. This is not the word for slave. This is the word that means to serve, like serve a meal, or to be a part-time kind of servant, okay? And throughout this passage, when you get the word servant or serve, it's that word, the noun is Diakonos, which is literally a servant, but not a slave.
Well, isn't that where we get our word for the diaconate?
And also the word deacon.
Deacon, yeah.
And also the word dean, D-E-A-N.
Mm-hmm.
And what else? I'm thinking, let's see, deacon, diaconite, dean. Yeah, so that's the word for servant. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus's feet. Okay, she rubbed it onto Jesus's feet and wiped them with her hair. I've wondered about what this actually means in terms of wiping it with her hair. I've not really read anything that seems to indicate the symbolism of that, or was it actually such? A human hair, I understand, if you let it grow on the head, it usually is about 3 feet long. It'll end somewhere down your back about 3 feet for the average person, sometimes longer or shorter. So it's clearly a sign of humility, because it was a slave who would wash the feet, or a servant that would wash the feet of someone coming into a home and having a meal or whatever. If you recall what Jesus did in washing the feet of his disciples at the Last Supper, that is clearly something a servant or a slave would do, not someone's teacher, not someone's rabbi. I forgot to look up this word litra, which they translated as pound. Does some other translation have a different figure there, instead a word instead of pound?
Mine has a pint.
Pint, okay. Oh, okay. I see. It's a Roman pound, 327.45 grams. And the question is, does the quantity suggest a royal burial? And that's the question here in the dictionary. But it's the word litra, and we get our word liter from that. A litra might have been a quantity used for a burial. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" Now, 300 denarii would be a huge sum of money, several $1,000s, if that's meant literally here. Because if you recall elsewhere, a laborer's wage was 1 denarius for a day's wage out in the fields. And this is 300. So we're talking about several months worth. If this were the case or anything like it, it would indicate that Mary had money. Mary and Martha were from a wealthier family, if this were the case. Well, let's go on. He, Judas, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Now, that's a very interesting comment, because if he was like the treasurer for the 12 apostles, he held a very high position in the group. And that's important to think about, that he was entrusted with any money they had together. We kind of aren't aware of that, that he held any high position, except indirectly from comments like this, that he was the one that held the money box, common purse, but he would steal from it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Any comments on that phrase? You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me.
After any comments on that, I want to go back to the previous paragraph.
I've heard some strange comments on this phrase, that it seems to say, since we're always going to have the poor with us, that we don't need to focus on the justice that really they deserve as human beings. It's some very strange comments you can read elsewhere. I don't know where that comes from. Anyway, David, what was the other thing you wanted to comment on?
It has to do with the use of the perfume. I think that the synoptics have the woman who I don't believe is named Mary, just a woman, putting the expensive perfume on Jesus's head. And I've been in a different group in which this led to some very heated and emotional exchanges as to what that means and what the role of women is. And there was one friend who had said, well, in the Old Testament, only a man could do that. Into the chat, this friend in another group quoted from the feminist theologian Elizabeth Schlussler Fiorenza, who said, since the prophet in the Old Testament anointed the head of the Jewish king, the anointing of Jesus's head must have been understood immediately as the prophetic recognition of Jesus. But it was a woman who named Jesus by and through her prophetic sign action. It was a politically dangerous story. Now, I realize this goes beyond what John says, but it is in our total tradition. And whether it's the feet or the head, the common element is that it's a generous, self-giving expression of love and adoration, whether there's a prophetic symbol in it or not, and whether the main point is anointing for burial or anointing for kingship. That's a debate. But it's interesting that John has it just on the feet and nothing about the messianic symbolism.
Yes, that's an important point. Let me just speak first, Sarah. One always needs to remember what I was saying at the beginning of this session about whatever the focus is of the writer, perhaps the head, the shoulders, other parts of the body where this perfume rubbed onto it as well. But whatever the symbolism was with regard to the feet is what he focused on. So often in so many places in the Gospels, we just get a little snippet, a little bit of the action that's happening at any place, and all the rest is understood, perhaps was understood by many of the listeners to hearing these Gospels read to them in that first century. So we just have to accept what we have there. So, okay, Sarah.
I was only going to mention that in the Gospel of Mark 14:4, it's the same question about wasting the oil, but this time they were in the house of Simon the leper, and a woman came in and poured the oil on his head. So it's very similar. And Jesus saying also, let her alone, why do you trouble her? And I'm thinking also, if this was passed down from oral tradition, it's understandable why it might be different, as stories.
Okay, good point. You brought up another kind of possibility here, that actually there was one particular anointing, but things are changed to pull out some spiritual meaning that the individual writer of that gospel wanted to do. And that's why you have this variation if there was just one. Just like I'm thinking of the multiplication of the loaves of bread. You have all four gospels recorded, but in one gospel, is that John? You have two multiplications, two times. Is that due to there were two oral histories or two written histories that were a bit different and referring to the same instance or not? But it clearly, when those two are talked about, they are talked about as different, and there's they even point to the differences in terms of the meaning. And I do recall that the numbers that are used there have different symbolic meanings. So the question is, what was the purpose of the writer of that particular gospel in saying what he wanted to say and how he changed and used the material he had available to him? See, I mean, we kind of think of truth and lies. They weren't thinking in those categories. These were teaching documents, and they were trying to teach spiritual truths through language, both literally, as I want to go back to origin, and spiritually. But of course, the spiritual was more important than the literal. And that we have to kind of think that way today too, as well as early friends did. They clearly I would times talk about other Christian opponents to Quakers as being literalist in a negative sense, where they should not have been. They missed the deeper spiritual meaning, signification of things. And that's still an issue today. And it's something I think is important when I'm dealing with some other Christian literalist, fundamentalist understanding. It's getting to the deeper spiritual sense, going beyond what words mean to something much deeper within us.
I think that the other story where Jesus is anointed, he follows it with something like, wherever this story is told, this will be a testament to me.
Yeah.
And so what he's emphasizing is the importance of the carryover into the future of his role and position, and that this will be a testament to that. So in a way, this is simply affirming the same idea that you've been saying, is that the spiritual is more important than the material. That's what he was saying, is that the spiritual gesture of being anointed has a greater significance than using the money in a way that would be dissipated, even though there would be some advantage to the poor, but it would disappear. I mean, there would be no residue of the importance of his mission in that action. But this is a story that is told, and it's retained in many, many million minds since that time, and it's had a very, very enriching influence on mankind in a way that spending that 300 denarii, I guess, for the poor would not have had. So it's, again, it's sort of looking at the spiritual as opposed to the material advantage there.
Mm-hmm. These reminded me also about the various gospel accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, what happened after the disciples or Mary Magdalene or the women or whatever went to the tomb. There are variations there where, you know, they see two angels, there's Jesus. I mean, and you can't match them. I mean, we're not to worry about that sort of thing. That was not what early Christians were concerned about. They had these stories handed down to them. They understood the spiritual import of them, and that's what really matters. And today, I think it's even harder for us modern English speakers to get to that, because our culture is so literalist and demands a literal understanding.
And yet we have fiction all the time, which speaks
Yes.
to something that is, you know, fiction is more true than fact, I guess, is the cliche about it. So that in a way that these are stories that tell us about spiritual reality rather than telling us about history.
Yes, absolutely.
What, you know, the facts.
I would like to speak up for the woman, because in the synoptic gospels, the story seems to end with, this is going to be she is going to be remembered. This is a memorial to her generosity, in praise of her. So it, to me, just gives the idea of this as community.
Not only generosity, but recognition of what she was doing.
I'm again thinking of something I've mentioned in the past. I remember once many years ago in Cambridge, Massachusetts, driving right by the hospital I was born in, Mount Auburn Hospital, and there was a bumper sticker on the car in front of me that said, "Concrete people are mixed up and set in their ways." And it's breaking into that concreteness that I think is where we as potential ministers of the true gospel somehow need to break into that with God's help, and with them allowing themselves to be open to God's grace to get beyond literalness. It's so easy to be literal. You just have the literal meaning there. But then there are problems when you get variations in these gospels. But still, it's the spiritual content that matters. It's such a intangible thing, or it's very fluid, like clouds in a sky, But that's the important thing, the spiritual, the non-material, the non-physical, but the reality, just like our thoughts in our heads are non-material. The brain is doing whatever it's doing electrically and chemically, but the thoughts are what matter.
It seems to me that people in those days might have not had as much of a differentiation between the real world and the spiritual world to begin with. We have a hard time, looking at that because we're so focused on science and what is actual fact, that it's hard for us to think about the spiritual values that float in the air around the physical things that we see. But people in those days didn't have science. All they had was what they saw and their faith.
Well, I would say they had a very primeval form of science, what they would have called knowledge. I mean, actually, our word science goes back to a Latin word, scio, S-C-I-O, which means know, K-N-O-W, knowledge. It's expanded a little bit over the last 2,000 years.
There were philosophers who tried to describe the nature of the world in a non-religious, well, in not such a religious way, like Confucius.
And I think the last chapter 11 in John, shows us Martha being very much that mindset of being very literal minded. She's very focused on using numbers to sort of explain what's real and what isn't. He's been dead 4 days, or there's a reliance on this sort of numerical, scientific mind way of thinking. I think Mary is shown in contrast to that. So I think that way of thinking was probably, it was there then too.
Yeah, we are such materialistic reductionists. We reduce everything down to a concrete material understanding. That's the way of our current world. That may not have been that way 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire, but so many people think that way. I mean, we're trained that way in the world today to think that way, I think, unfortunately. I can even say that of those Christians who think that way and use Christian language to speak in those terms. Again, I just want to stress, as early friends and traditional friends have stressed, the spirit and the world are two separate things. The material world is the material world. The spirit, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God is something above and beyond, but also in that material world. And that is truth. That is the reality, what is really true. I guess there's a lot more we could say about this, but I'm not.
Can I chime in here? I am on board with getting the spiritual message, but I still don't know that it's entirely like self-evident to me. And maybe I would like to discuss, what do people think about that, right? Maybe I'm too much of like, my social ethics are so strong. It seems odd to me. Judas, which we find out he's got arguably a position of power, is sort of, Judas is obviously a problematic moral or spiritual character in the narrative. He's the one advocating for, helping out the poor, which of course is a huge part of the sort of the justice vision of the Jews in particular. And also, like, it's confusing. Jesus says Mary had to keep this perfume for the day of my burial, but she just used it. I'm like confused by that. It's not the day of his burial, of course, literally, but what the heck does that mean when she just used it? Also, like, my translation is different. You had for terio or whatever in Greek.
Verse.
7. Jesus therefore said, leave her alone. She had to buy. Both times your translation had either buying or purchasing earlier in as well. Mine takes it as just keeping.
Yes, okay. I mean, my English translation added that to make it clearer. The Greek does not have buy. It just says that she may keep it.
So in short, I think I have a bunch of mysteries that don't really make sense to me. Okay, so does anointing with perfume mean that we just worship God? Does that mean, what does it sort of mean, right? It's not clear to me. And again, I'm sorry if I'm dense.
Let me say something about this Litra, this Roman pound. That's a lot of perfume to put on one person at one time. I can't imagine it all going on. It would be, overwhelming if you had a pound of quart or a liter of cologne put on you. It'd be just too much. So I'm not even sure if we're just talking about some of that she had. But
what would that say about Jesus if he just got doused with like a bath of perfume and he was into it? I mean, seriously, I don't know what that means. That just really seems like a mystery to me. That's not at all obvious or clear. I certainly know the fundamentalist things like, oh, don't worry about the poor, just pray to God. But on the other hand, I don't know what that means. That's all those things. It really doesn't make sense to me.
I have to agree with Chris, in part because with so many of these passages, we don't have the full context. And we can fill it out sometimes by knowing from other sources what would happen here. This was written for people of their time who understood all of these meanings, denotative, connotative meanings of these words in the Greek as to just what was happening. And they could more easily get to what the intention of the author was in saying whatever he said here.
Well, one of the things that these verses tell us is that Jesus is alerting people that he's going to be dying. I mean, we know that already. That's the main narrative. But the people he's speaking with there don't know it. And he is not only bringing that forward for them, but he perhaps is also accepting that himself. And it's leading up to the time when he's arrested and crucified. So this is one of the first acknowledgments that that's going to be happening. And having it associated with this ointment is making it concrete, both for him and for the others. It's a gesture that his death will be occurring. It's an act that affirms that he's going to die, and he knows he's going to die, and he's telling people he's going to die through this, what he says right here.
I would think if this is true that litra meant a Roman pound, and if that Roman pound was the amount that would be used for a Roman burial, the whole body would be covered with it. That is clearly saying something about his death that was to come. And that would be understood by those who are listening to this gospel being read to them in that first century.
Was carrying the purse really was it really such a position of responsibility? Christ didn't seem to care so much about money, and having Judas be the one in charge of it could make it seem that he cared even less about money than he.
Well, I would say that of Jesus, but just heard this said, that's why I'm repeating something here, but I think there's some truth to it that among the 12 apostles, he would have given this to someone who had the ability or the knowledge of how to deal with money and use it wisely and whatnot, so that he was trusted in a certain way. Although what's actually being said is that he was pilfering from the money box, even though he had that position. I mean, we don't hear much else, because of what Judas did, we really don't know much about his position and his history and everything else, less so than some of the other apostles. Actually, there are a number of apostles we don't know much about at all. There are legends about them, but they're not in these gospels. Okay, I'd say let's go on a little bit more. Okay, verse 9. When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and were believing in Jesus. They were putting their confidence in what Jesus was saying, in his spiritual understandings and overall ministry. All right, let me go on.
Henry, could you make a comment on this apparently grammatical construction about putting Lazarus to death? Yeah, okay, it's in 10. Apokteno Lazarus apoktenio.
All right, it's in 10?
Yeah, it uses that same word twice.
Okay, yeah, it's that's the subjunctive mood, apoktenosin, that they might kill Lazarus. Let's see, they thought among themselves, so they planned. They're making plans. The chief priests were making plans in order or so that they might kill Lazarus, because many were going away. Many of the Jews were going away on account of him and were putting their trust in Jesus.
I don't know how the Greek functions grammatically there and why that verb is used twice.
Where is it twice?
On either side of Lazarus.
I only have it once.
Ooh.
At the very end of 10 in the Greek. The one verb, they may kill him, they might kill him, in order or so that they might kill Lazarus.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe it's different versions of Greek then.
Henry,
Yes.
if I could just ask a question.
Go ahead.
In verse 10, I have, but the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also. So is that saying that their intention at that time was also to put Jesus to death? They had made up their minds at that time?
1 second, let me just look at 12. I'm looking to see if there are variations in this. 12:10. I don't see any variations in the textual commentary. One more place. It just might be a different manuscript. That's all I'm thinking.
Yeah.
No, I don't see anything there. No, I don't know why you have it twice. It's only once. Okay, let me continue here. Verse 12. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, Do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. His disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written of him and had been done to him. So the crowd that had been with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify about that. It was also because they heard that he had performed this sign that the crowd went to meet him. The Pharisees then said to one another, You see, you can do nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. Let me see here. In verse 13, Blessed is the one coming in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel. And Jesus having found donkey, a little donkey, a young donkey, sat down on it, just as it was written, had been written. Don't fear, do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Look, the king, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. Okay. Now, this is amazing because, number one, kings would never sit on a donkey. A donkey was an ordinary, everyday, poor man's kind of beast. Kings, royalty, and the Roman army would sit on horses. That's a big difference. And here you've got someone being called king, and he's on this poor man's beast of burden, a donkey. Something clearly is very different here. The one who comes in the name of the Lord, one who comes in the power. The name, of course, is that basic essence of God, and as Friends understood it, and early Christians, and that's the power of God, that enormous power that runs the universe, the world. And of course, do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. Well, if it were a king on a horse leading an army of soldiers on horses and whatnot, you should be afraid. But look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt, a very different kind of king.
There's a cross-reference to Zechariah, Zechariah 9:9, and I haven't looked it up, but I just wonder, why does Zechariah say that the king is coming on a donkey?
Oh, can you read that?
Well, I'm just seeing a cross-reference to Zechariah
Okay.
9:9.
Rejoice, rejoice, daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, daughter of Jerusalem. For see, your king is coming to you, his cause won, his victory gained, humble and mounted on an ass, on a foal, the young of a she-ass. That's New English translation.
Yeah. Well, what was that verse again?
9:9, yes.
9:9, okay. Let me just see what this translation says. Yeah, this is the humility. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he. And then, quote, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. It's that humility we're talking about here, sitting on a donkey rather than on a horse as a king. Of course, we miss this because we don't have that sense of the difference there. We have to have this explained to us, why this meant something to the original hearers of this that we've lost, because donkeys, horses, we don't see the difference in that they did in their culture.
The donkey was the Tacoma pickup of its day.
It was the what?
Tacoma pickup of its day. So you can think about hundreds of them walking all over the Middle East carrying their burdens. Donkeys were cheap.
Yeah.
Well, I've never sat on either, so I don't know. And I don't think I've ever been in a Tacoma as well.
They still are humble animals. 20 some years ago, I kind of took a gap year and ended up in rural Mexico, and I named a pretty poor person. We was hanging out in a very small town, and I named the donkey, and a gringo heard that I named the donkey and was like, "Stop! Don't do that. You don't name donkeys. No, you don't do that. It's insulting to people."
You know, presidents don't ride Tacoma pickups.
Okay.
Neither does the mayor.
Yeah.
I feel very moved by this passage, and then reading this and thinking about the perfume again, and just maybe it's because I come from a more evangelical church when I was growing up, and there was, there was a song about this particular incident, and it was just kind of a rejoicing kind of song. And so when I think when I read this now, I mean, I know that the crucifixion is coming, but this crowd is rejoicing, and it seems like Mary also seems to understand who Jesus is, and I just and so it's just kind of, it's very poignant, I think, knowing what's going to come, but also that it feels like some people do understand.
Mhm.
So I just feel very moved by this scene that is unfolding.
These reminding me of this same scene among early friends with James Naylor reenacting the scene in was it the city of Brighton or Bristol, one of the two, for which he was then, I'm sorry?
Bristol.
Bristol, thanks. I've been to both. He was then declared a blasphemer for that very action. At that time, it was considered, I gather, so shocking, at least to the anti-Quakers, that he was declared a blasphemer. And then, of course, he was horribly treated and was basically treated so that they thought he would die, but he didn't die. With 311 lashes on his back and being bored with a hot iron in his tongue and on his forehead, B for blasphemer. It was amazing that he was able to survive that kind of punishment. It really is amazing. It's interesting because in our culture, if someone did that, no one would think twice about it, I think. But clearly, at that time, it was considered blasphemous, and it caused a great problem for Quakers, too, at that time. And there was a real split with George Fox and James Naylor over this that took a while, another year or two, through, was it John Bernier or Dewsbury, who had to intercede to have Fox and Naylor come together again over it. Of course, Naylor, a couple of years after this happened, was waylaid on a road and basically left to die. He did die. It's not clear whether it was incited by the government or it just happened to be a random kind of action. So.
And his quote that he gave before he died, I think it was him. It was just so tender. Yes. It really, and it just makes me think, oh, he went through all that torture, but then he writes this such a forgiving and loving statement, and I love that statement.
Be wise to get that and read that next time, actually. It's not very long.
I think what also, David has said here is important, is that this moment is sort of like everything is lifting him up and giving him the adulation that he deserves. And yet that will very quickly disappear. But this scene is when he is being acknowledged, both by Mary and by the people in general.
One other thing, too, before I forget, that the trial of James Naylor before Parliament, he was asked if he thought he was Christ, and he said, no, I am not Christ, but Christ is in me. And that is a pure Quaker understanding.
Henry, Nancy had her hand up a while ago.
Oh, I never watch hands. Nancy, what did they have to say?
I wanted to point out that the followers of Jesus, it says, did not understand at first, but after he was raised to glory, they remembered. And I think that was true throughout, that many things they didn't understand at the time, if anything, really. Yet later, the Lord put it back in their remembrance, and it was clear to them. And also, I want to be careful that people don't think that we don't believe at all in the history, or that these things were actually being lived out at one time, even though it seems to us that some things are contradictory, but they're not. And I think it's helpful to see why that may have been, but even we don't understand the whole thing, and we don't want anybody to think that we do. It's just that he reveals it because he is alive today in our hearts.
Thanks for that reminder that it's definitely so important to discern what needs to be taken as literally or historically having happened, along with the deeper understanding of the Spirit. I mean, you can't say, well, maybe Jesus didn't get crucified or wasn't resurrected, wasn't raised up by God the Father. No, I mean, if you're a true believer, you really believe these actual things happened, and other things as well. You know, discernment is a serious, important thing to do. I want to put that in context, though, that if you look at all the hundreds of variations of Christian denominations, all disagreeing over various points of how they interpret the Bible, that wasn't the case in early Christianity. You know, they didn't fight over these things as they've been fighting over them for the last 400 or 500 years in Christianity. And I'm trying to put our mindsets back to an earlier type of mindset of early Christianity or early Quakers. But it is important to be able to discern what is really essential, what did historically happen. These aren't sort of made up myths, fictional myths. No, they weren't writing that for that reason or in that way.
Does it seem like part of the discrimination is deciding what's more important and less important? I'm thinking like it's pretty important what we believe about the death and resurrection, but is it so important that what we believe about virgin birth?
I myself would think that way, that actually, if the resurrection didn't happen, then everything else doesn't matter as much. I mean, that is the number one, the most crucial thing in Christianity, as early friends understood it, as well as early Christians. Without that, Jesus was another good man, another prophet, but what was it why did God raise him up from the dead? And that's the crux of everything. He was a human being, but the Spirit of Christ was in him fully. And he didn't have to do what he did, because if he weren't human and just God, he'd have no choice. But as human beings, we have a choice to do good or evil, to obey God or not obey God. And Jesus obeyed God completely. And Paul says that in his epistles. And that's the model we need to follow.
But the virgin birth is important because God was his father. He planted that seed. So that's important too.
I mean, among Jews at that time, they had a very different understanding of making babies and having babies and whatnot. It was understood that the women provided the body of a baby, but the man provided the spirit. You know, we're talking about the seed, the semen, but it was the spirit that came from the man. Clearly, the spirit of Jesus was that total spirit of God the Father. And that's why God is his father. I mean, this whole virgin birth, we could spend a long time here talking about this, and I think we have to stop. It's already beyond our time, I think. That will come up maybe when we read Matthew or Luke. Those are the two gospel accounts that mention it. Mark and John do not mention it, again, for different reasons. Go ahead, George.
There's just been a thought tonight on part of the discussion I just want to comment on. And like I said, it's just sort of a thought process, but we talk about the spiritual realm, we talk about the physical, as if there's a very distinct division or point between the physical world and the spiritual world. And then we also tend to think that there's a difference between the religious community and the science community, that one looks at the spiritual, one looks at the physical. But to me, is it really possible to look at everything on a continuum? Because one dividing point between the physical and the spiritual may be limited by what our eyes can physically see. So what we can physically see is the physical world, what we can't see is the spiritual world. But to a chemist, in another set of eyes that we develop with technology, we see things, and I think on a molecular level. So I visualize a world of particles and molecules and atoms and all that we don't see, but is very real, that does exist, and is such an important part of our world. But then the question I would ask is, what we're seeing there that chemists see is again limited by the set of visions or eyes that our technology has today. So with that being said, 100 years from now, we maybe see another level of existence. So sometimes I think possibly as we learn more about the human body, now we think of the human bodies as an ecosystem, and there's more microorganisms present than body cells. So it's a very vibrant ecosystem rather than a separate entity from a larger ecosystem. So with that being said, I wonder as we look at the spiritual, the physical, as we view life in the world and faith, if it may really exist in reality on sort of a continuum between what we physically see and what we spiritually experience. But I'm not too good with words, but it's just some thoughts I had as we think about that. And I've always had a problem trying to draw the line at a certain point based on the capabilities we have to visualize things or see things, both in our physical being and in the technology and the world that we exist in.
We are both. Okay. We should end now. I did want to say one last thing about the virgin birth. This came up with the Hicksite heresy too, as to the interpretations there. I've not really studied that much, but that was one of the points. All the breakups in the 19th century had to do with theology, with beliefs, with doctrines, teachings, and this didn't happen in the same way with early Christianity. It did in one sense with the Gnostics, but I think we have to stop. We've gone way beyond time here. A lot of different things have been mentioned tonight that need to be mentioned again and further elucidated and talked about. So, okay, I think we'll end there. Next week, we'll see what those Greeks wanted to talk to Jesus about. So we will meet again next week. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everybody.
See you next
Good
week.
evening, friends.
See you next.
Okay.
This podcast has been a production of Ohio Yearly Meeting. It was hosted by Henry Jason and edited by Chip Thomas, who also read our introductory quote and credits. We welcome feedback on this or any of our podcast episodes. We can be contacted through our website, ohioyearlymeeting.org.